The text my stepmother sent was 3 words long, and she'd attached a video. I almost didn't open it. I was sitting in the parking lot of the Sunridge Estates long term care facility in Calgary, still in my Canadian Armed Forces dress uniform, still trying to slow my heartbeat down from what had just happened inside. My hands were shaking. Not from cold. It was late September, yes, but the shaking wasn't weather. It was the kind of shaking that happens when your body understands something before your brain has caught up. I opened the video anyway. It was me, from 30 minutes ago, standing at the front of the facility's main lounge, where the staff had arranged chairs and a small podium and a Canadian flag for the occasion. I was receiving my Meritorious Service Medal, a ceremony that my commanding officer, Colonel Hartley, had arranged to happen here specifically because my father was a resident, because he had dementia and couldn't travel, because I had asked if we could bring the ceremony to him so he could see it. In the video, Colonel Hartley was pinning the medal to my chest. My father was sitting in the front row in his wheelchair, and for a moment, just a moment, he had looked at me with something clear in his eyes, like he remembered, like he knew exactly who I was and what I'd done and why it mattered. And then, you could hear my stepmother's voice, just off camera, loud enough for the microphone to catch it. She'd leaned toward my aunt and said, in that particular tone she'd perfected over 20 years, the tone that could gut you and still technically be deniable at a dinner party. She always did love a uniform more than she loved her own family. The text she sent said, "Thought you'd want this." She had filmed it herself. She had filmed my father's face and her own commentary and sent it to me. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. My name is Nadia. I'm 31 years old and I've been a signals intelligence analyst with the Canadian Armed Forces for 8 years. I grew up in Edmonton, in a house that smelled like my father's coffee and my mother's garden until I was 9 years old, and then my mother died and the garden went to weeds, and eventually my father remarried, and the house smelled like someone else entirely. My stepmother's name is Pauline. She came into our lives when I was 11, and she was efficient about it. Moved in, redecorated, reorganized. She had a son from her first marriage, my stepbrother Gavin, who was 2 years older than me and shared her particular talent for making you feel like an intruder in your own home. My father loved her. I think he still does. In whatever way he's still capable of loving anything. That's the thing about watching someone disappear into dementia. You grieve them while they're still in the room. I joined the military at 22 after my degree in computer science at the University of Alberta. My father had been proud, briefly and practically. He shook my hand at my commissioning ceremony. Pauline had worn a dress that was slightly too festive, like she was attending a garden party she hadn't particularly wanted to come to. Over the years, I had been posted to bases across the country: Petawawa, Esquimalt, finally Ottawa, and the distance from Edmonton had suited everyone. Pauline and I maintained a careful civility over Christmas visits and birthday phone calls. My father's illness had made even that harder. He'd been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at 64. By the time he was 68, he needed full time care. Pauline had moved him into Sunridge, which was a good facility. I had checked, I had researched, I had flown back twice to visit it before agreeing. She had power of attorney. I had nothing legal, only the position of daughter, which in Pauline's accounting had always been a kind of consolation prize. The medal I received that September was for work I'd done the previous year, analytical work supporting a signals intelligence operation that I cannot describe in full, except to say that it had required 18 months of meticulous, patient, unglamorous work, the kind of work that doesn't look like anything from the outside, but that had ultimately contributed to the disruption of a serious threat to Canadian Forces personnel deployed overseas. People I'd never met had come home because of what my team had found. That was enough. That had always been enough. Pauline did not see it that way. Pauline had seen a daughter who chose a career over family, who wasn't around when her father needed her, who had flown in for a ceremony in a fancy uniform to collect an award and take up space. That was the version of me that she sent the video to document. I didn't sleep well that night. I was staying at the Marriott downtown. I had a flight back to Ottawa the following afternoon, and I lay in the dark with my phone on the pillow and my thoughts moving in circles. Something had been bothering me since the ceremony. Not the video, not Pauline's comment, not the stiffness in my aunt's face when she'd heard it. Something else. Something concrete. During the reception afterward, staff had put out squares and timbits in the lounge. Bless them. My father's primary care nurse, a careful and kind woman who had been with him for 2 years, had pulled me aside. She'd looked uncomfortable. She said she probably shouldn't say anything, and then she said it anyway, because she was the kind of person who couldn't quite help being decent. She told me that over the past several months, a man had been visiting my father regularly. Not Pauline, not Gavin, someone else. He'd signed in as a family friend. He'd had long visits, private, in my father's room. The nursing staff had thought nothing of it initially. Residents with dementia still had social connections. Old colleagues, neighbors, friends from before. It wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that after two of those visits, my father had become agitated and distressed in a way that was different from his normal presentation. Not confused in the ordinary way, frightened. He'd said to one of the night nurses, during a brief window of clarity, that someone was asking him questions he couldn't answer, that they kept asking about documents, about codes. My father had worked for 30 years as a senior logistics coordinator for a defense contractor based in Edmonton. He'd had a security clearance. Not top secret, not the level I worked at, but significant. He'd handled procurement information, shipping manifests, supply chain details for contracts that touched on Canadian military infrastructure. He'd retired 8 years before his diagnosis. Most of what he'd known was dated. Most. Not all. I lay in the hotel room and thought about that word. Most. I thought about the facility's visitor log, which was a physical book at the front desk, sign in name and time and date. I thought about the fact that I had, professionally speaking, a very particular set of skills for finding things out. And I thought about my father sitting in his wheelchair, frightened, being asked questions he couldn't answer. In the morning, I went back to Sunridge. The front desk staff knew me by then. I asked to see the visitor log, explaining I was trying to track down an old family friend who'd been visiting my father and whom I'd been hoping to reconnect with. It was almost entirely true, I told myself. The name in the log, written in careful printed letters across 11 separate visits over 6 months, was Marcus Webb. I knew that name. Not well, not from my own life, but from my father's. Marcus Webb had been a junior procurement officer at the same defense contractor where my father worked 30 years ago briefly, before a quiet departure that my father had mentioned once years ago in passing. Something about irregularities, something about an internal review. My father had been part of that review. Webb had left the company. My father had stayed. I photographed every page of the log with my phone and drove back to the hotel and called a colleague I trusted in Ottawa. I told him what I had and what I suspected and asked him to run a quiet preliminary check. He called me back 4 hours later. His voice was careful. He said, "Nadia, don't go anywhere. Someone needs to talk to you today." That someone turned out to be two people from the RCMP's National Security Enforcement Team who arrived at my hotel room at 6 in the evening and who already knew Marcus Webb's name and who had, it turned out, been building a file on him for 14 months. They told me what they could. Webb had spent the past 3 decades in the private sector, moving between consulting firms, always adjacent to defense and infrastructure work. He had, over time, developed financial relationships with interests that were not Canadian. He had been, for at least 5 years, passing information, old information sometimes, contextual information, the kind of information that by itself meant little but that, assembled piece by piece, could illuminate things that were meant to stay dark. And he had apparently spent the past 6 months trying to determine whether my father still had access to archived records, physical documents from his career that had never been properly recalled, documents that contained supply chain specifications from the late 90s and early 2000s, documents that were 30 years old but that pertained to infrastructure still in use. My father, in his lucid moments, had apparently told Webb he didn't know what he was talking about. In his less lucid moments, he had, without understanding what he was doing, mentioned a storage locker in Edmonton's South End that my father had maintained for years and that no one in the family had thought to sort through. Pauline knew about the locker. She had the key. She had been, the RCMP officers told me, cooperating with Webb. Not out of ideology, not out of any conviction, out of money, out of a debt Gavin had accumulated. Significant, the kind that comes from the particular combination of a failed business venture and bad financial decisions, the details of which I won't go into. And Webb had offered to solve that problem in exchange for access. $73,000. That's what my father's 30-year security clearance was worth to Pauline. That's what she'd decided his documents, his career, his clearance were worth. $73,000 Canadian, wired in 3 installments to an account in Gavin's name. I sat in that hotel room with 2 RCMP officers and felt something go very quiet and very cold inside me. The investigation that followed was not mine to lead. That's not how it works. I gave my statement. I handed over the photographs of the visitor log. I provided everything I knew about my father's storage locker and Pauline's access to it, and then I was told, politely and firmly, that I needed to step back and let the appropriate people handle it. I flew back to Ottawa. I went back to work. I told almost no one. That is the part people don't show you in movies, the waiting. The weeks of silence, punctuated by occasional calls from the RCMP officer handling the case, a woman named Sergeant Delacree, who was measured and professional and gave me information only when there was something I legally needed to know. I did my job. I ate dinner. I called the care facility to check on my father and spoke to the nurses, who were wonderful, who kept me informed. Pauline kept sending me cheerful text updates about my father's condition, written with the confident obliviousness of someone who did not yet know that their life was about to change. She sent me a photo of him eating breakfast. She sent me a reminder about his birthday. She asked if I was planning to visit for Christmas. I didn't answer that one. 3 months after the hotel room meeting, on a Tuesday morning in December, the RCMP executed a search warrant on the storage locker, on Pauline and Gavin's respective residences, and on Marcus Webb's condo in a high rise in Edmonton's West End. They recovered the documents, they recovered financial records, they recovered Webb's communications with his overseas contacts, which were apparently more extensive than the investigators had initially estimated. Webb was charged with breach of trust, possession of government documents, and, following the examination of his communications, with offenses under the Security of Information Act. The Crown took a long time with the file because they wanted it solid. Pauline was charged with aiding and abetting. Gavin was charged as well. I found out about the charges from Sergeant Delacroix, who called me on a Wednesday morning while I was eating toast in my kitchen in Ottawa. She read me the charges in the careful, neutral voice of someone who has had to deliver news like this many times and has learned not to editorialize. When she finished, there was a brief silence, and then she said, in a slightly different voice, "You did the right thing bringing this to us when you did." I said, "Thank you." I hung up the phone. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. I thought about my father, who had worked for 30 years with his clearance intact, who had never in his life done anything to betray the trust placed in him, who was now sitting in a memory care facility, not knowing who was Prime Minister or sometimes what year it was, who had looked at me for one clear moment at my medal ceremony with something that might have been pride. I thought about the video Pauline had sent me. She always did love a uniform more than she loved her own family. I thought about the fact that she had said that while simultaneously negotiating the sale of my family's integrity. I cried, and then I washed my face, and then I went to work. The proceedings took the better part of a year. I was not a witness in the criminal trial. My role had been investigative and referral, not evidentiary, and the Crown built their case on the documents and financial records and Webb's communications. I followed the coverage when I could. I spoke to a family lawyer about my father's situation, his power of attorney, his care arrangements, his assets. Pauline's charges complicated her legal standing considerably. The process of reassigning his care decisions was not simple, and it was not fast, and it cost me money I hadn't budgeted for and emotional energy I didn't always feel like I had. My aunt helped. She was my mother's sister, and she had never liked Pauline, and she had the particular fierceness of a woman in her late 60s who has decided she has nothing left to prove. She drove to Edmonton. She attended meetings with lawyers. She sat in the facility's family conference room with me on a video call and held things together at the physical end while I managed the paperwork from Ottawa. Webb received a federal sentence of 9 years. The Crown had pushed for more. His lawyer had pushed for less. 9 years was where it landed, with the judge noting in her sentencing remarks the particular seriousness of exploiting a person with dementia for intelligence adjacent purposes, the premeditation involved, and the potential harm to Canadian interests. Pauline received a conditional sentence and 3 years of probation. Gavin received a similar arrangement with conditions including repayment of the funds received. The judge found that neither of them had understood the full extent of what Webb was using the information for, that they'd understood they were doing something wrong but not the national security dimension of it. And that affected the sentencing. I had feelings about that. I'm still having them, but that is how the law works. And I have, over the course of my career, learned to respect that the system is built on more than my feelings about any particular outcome. Pauline's power of attorney over my father was revoked. My aunt and I share that responsibility now jointly, and it is hard and it is ongoing, and it is one of those things that has no satisfying resolution, only management. My father does not know what happened. On my last visit, in March, he called me by my mother's name for about 20 minutes, and then he looked at me and said, "You're Nadia," with a kind of wondering surprise. And I said, "Yes, Dad, I'm Nadia." And he said, "You turned out well," and then he fell asleep in his chair. I did not buy a storage locker or a company or a piece of land that had sentimental significance. There was no auction, no symbolic reclamation. Real life doesn't always offer you that. What I got was the quiet knowledge that the documents were recovered before they could do harm, that my father's name was never made public in connection with any of this, that his privacy was protected, that the people who had used him were being held accountable, and I got the care of him. The slow, non-linear, exhausting, sometimes unbearable care of sitting with someone who is disappearing and being present for whatever part of them is still there. That is what I have. That is what I chose. The medal is in a small wooden box on the bookshelf in my Ottawa apartment. I don't look at it often. I don't need to. I know what it's for. I know what I did to earn it, and I know what I did in that parking lot in Calgary, shaking, and what I did in that hotel room, and every tedious, careful step after that. I wore that uniform more than I loved my family. That's what she said. I have thought about this a great deal. And I think the truest thing I can say is this: I wore that uniform because I loved my family, because I loved my father, who taught me that a promise made to something larger than yourself is a promise worth keeping. Because I believed and still believe that the things worth protecting are worth the cost of protecting them. Because when someone tried to sell my father's integrity for $73,000, I was the one who could do something about it. That's not a uniform over family. That's a uniform and family, together the same thing. I don't expect Pauline to understand that. I'm not sure she has the kind of inner life that could hold it, but I do. And I carry it with me every day, like a weight that is also somehow a foundation.